Today we're going to go over diversity in the workplace, diversity in engineering. First, we're going to cover gender diversity, and then we're going to cover racial diversity. Um, I This is a very important topic, um, and I'm a little embarrassed to say, but all of the engineering books we have that talk about ethics either do not talk about the subject at all, or the last paragraph of content is, oh, and hey, there's going to be women in the workplace. Um, and that's it's just a disservice to the entire class. Um, Part of the reason I'm talking about this is you are going to run into people who are just opposed to diversity in the workplace. It's going to happen. Um, and people are going to behave different based off of where you sit on the diversity spectrum. Uh, One example of this, and this happens here at URI, and URI is supposed to be a pretty diverse, liberal place, but it happens. Um, I work with a woman named Jenna Cragen. She and I are integral in the hiring process for the NIUVT. Jenna does a handful of security checks, and I enforce them, and then once those security checks have been executed, someone's allowed to join a project. Um, and she frequently will send me a text message or email like, hey, can you come to my office real quick? And I will repeat word for word what she has told somebody. I won't say anything different, except I will have a tie on and a deeper tone when I say, you must follow these rules. And they'll hear me word for word, and they'll understand what I'm saying, but they will argue with her about it. Um, Now, we've never had somebody explicitly state, hey, I'm going to follow the rules because you're a guy and Jenna's a woman. That hasn't happened, but that definitely is the sense that we're getting in these situations. Um, and this happens all the time. Um, so, Engineering Code of Ethics states engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in areas of their competence, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. All right, so I strongly recommend, if you are not already part of SWE, joining SWE. It's a professional organization. Its goal is to promote women. You do not need to be a woman to join. It was founded in the 1950s. There's over 40,000 members. Their network is fantastic. It provides resources to students, and once you're in the workforce, it still provides a lot of resources to you to help you network, get professional development, things like that. They go out of their way to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the engineering profession. Um, and that's not just gender inclusion. That's everybody, right? Um, there is no obligation. I realize I'm repeating myself, but you do not need to be a woman, and you don't need to be an engineer to join. And so you don't really have a good reason to not want to join the society. It provides a lot of benefits. There might be, once you get into the professional world, a cost barrier, but outside of that, I would strongly recommend you join. Um, it's common for people who are computer scientists to join, human resources. There are a lot of people who are part of SWE. Um, and if you're just interested in doing outreach, this is a great arm or mechanism to do that. Now, there's other organizations here on campus that say, all right, you're not an engineer, but you would still like some representation. We have URI Women in STEM. It emphasizes the importance of establishing relationships with professors and peers through network sessions and encourages their members to access research opportunities, internships, leadership roles, things like that. Um, You don't necessarily need to join this, but I would strongly recommend if you have the opportunity, at least connect with them, network with them. So for gender diversity, if you look at organizations where they go out of their way, especially engineering organizations, where they go out of their way to make sure that there is some diversification, there is better performance. Um, it leads to improved market share, advances in the new market. Um, the companies tend to be more profitable. Um, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One of them is we work in a diverse society. When you go sell something, the truth is when you're designing something, you're designing it for how you think you should be using it. That's the reality of the situation. And without reaching out to people, having a sophisticated marketing arm that actually pulls data from the customer, you don't really know how they're going to use it. And by having a second pair of eyes on it saying, hey, that might be how you guys would use it, but if I were to use it, I would use it this other way, or these are factors that I care about the most. And by doing that, you actually make a better product, which leads to better success. And this happens with cars quite frequently. A lot of minivans, they didn't really exist until a handful of moms were like, hey, I kind of need this. And they were actually part of the design process. Um, where, dad only looked at what he needed, his daily driver, and then sure enough, eventually a mom got involved. I forget whether it was GM or Ford. I honestly don't remember. Um, but she said, hey, I need this vehicle. I need to drive around my kids. I have all these activities I need to do. This is what I really want in the vehicle. And it came into existence because instead of having dad, who was the daily driver, mom was the designer and the daily driver. So there's a utilitarian reason why you want diversity, especially in uh, gender diversity. There is increased innovation. Uh, by having a larger group with a wider background, you have a better problem-solving ability. Um, you have improved economic outcomes, and it addresses social issues related to gender inequality. And there's a Kantian reason why you would want gender diversity. Um, by forbidding diversity, especially gender diversity, you're disrespecting their humanity and their dignity. You really can't universalize it without being really. I can't envision a way where you would be able to universalize forbidding the other gender from participating. I can't do it. And then there are categorical imperatives. A moral duty that is binding on all individuals regardless of their personal preference or interest. Now, these are really common issues faced by women. There's lack of representation or role models. Um, so when I was a student here at URI, I had my parents every weekend talk to me saying I can do it. And the thing is, my dad had 3 engineering degrees. I knew he was able to do it. He's not that much smarter than I am, so I should be able to do it. So I had a role model. My uncle, he was an engineer. My father-in-law, he was an engineer. So my wife, who was also an engineer, had somebody to look up to say, I can get there. But a lot of people don't have that. And so when there aren't a lot of role models in the workforce, it's really hard to motivate yourself to become an engineer. Um, my mom has a funny story where my dad and my uncle Steve, they both thought they were failing the entire semester. And this was a regular occurring event. But the first time it happened, where both my dad and my Uncle Steve thought they were failing all of their classes, my mom took that to mean that she could fail all of her classes. And so she did. And then at the end of the semester, she wanted to have like a united front when she went to go talk to my grandparents. And it wasn't until she spilled the beans that she failed all her classes. Did my dad and my Uncle Steve explain, no, we got all A's and B's, we just thought we were failing the entire time? Every engineer, or the vast majority of engineers I've talked to who went to URI, have a similar story where they thought they were failing the entire time, and then when they finally got their grades, it was all A's and B's. This is not an uncommon thing, but if you are in that situation, you don't have somebody cheerleading you through it, it's really easy to skip it and just say, forget it, I'm going to go find something easier to do. There are very strong stereotypes and biases against women in the workforce. I don't know where this comes from. I'll be honest with you, I've observed in the workforce, women are a lot better at project management than men. As silly as it sounds, just writing down the minutes from a meeting, which women are a lot more apt to do than men, is very useful from a management standpoint. It actually gets tasks done because it assigns responsibility to people, and most people don't do it. Um, some places, either intentionally or subconsciously, will make their workforce male dominated. Uber got in trouble for this. Um, there was a period of time where they didn't hire any women for any upper management positions. And the reason they got in trouble was they basically got caught. It was an unwritten rule. Um, and one of the women who was way overqualified for a position got turned down for somebody who was basically an entry level employee, got the promotion, and that's when the lawsuit happened. But it's frustrating that it has to be that extreme for some places to do anything. And then there's also this expectation, the work-life balance. Um, certain positions forbid women who can get pregnant from doing them. I, there is a certain level of, I understand that in that statement. There's certain chemical processing jobs you should probably not be doing if you're pregnant. However, there are OSHA rules just stating regular people shouldn't be huffing chemicals. And if that job is genuinely in that situation, you should be getting all of the PPE that protects you so you can do the job. Um, mothers also receive this double standard, and like it is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Where, all right, they get pregnant, they have the baby, and so half of the employers will say, well, why didn't you come back right away? You only needed 4 weeks to heal, which isn't true. And then the other half will say, well, why are you coming back so quickly? And the thing is, there are a handful of people that it doesn't matter what you actually do. They will just pick one of those and be mad at you about it. Um, to give you an example, my wife got pregnant, had my son Teddy, and then after about 8 weeks, she came back. The reason it took 8 weeks is she had a C-section, which required her to have major abdominal surgery, and she literally couldn't stand up for 4 weeks. Um, and it hurt her a lot to move around, but she was able to come back after 8 weeks. More than half of the office complained to her for showing up at all, and the other half of the office complained to her because she didn't show up sooner. And one of the employees complained about both. And she brought it up to the person like, hey, which one could I have done that would have made you happy? And, he got caught, but he was that much of a jackass that he just pretended it didn't happen. The other is, and this is really frustrating for me because I deal with it and it's annoying as hell. So I used to work at Newark, and Newark on the Navy base has a daycare. And my son Teddy went to said daycare. And if my son got sick at daycare, I would have to leave Newark and take him home. It was just how things worked. And a lot of my managers would say things like, well, can't Sarah do that? And the thing is, like, when you get into the workforce, you talk about your spouse. they know enough about your spouse, like where they work and stuff like that, where they should know, and my bosses did know that my wife worked in Massachusetts. She worked in Boston. For her to pick up Teddy when he gets sick would take over an hour. It would take me 5 minutes. It didn't make sense for her to go do that. That was a job I should have been doing. But their logic wasn't, oh, this is inconvenient for me, or you don't have enough sick time. I worked for Newark. I had plenty of sick time. And I was perfectly capable, and the vast majority of the time, I would work from home once Teddy got sick. There was no inconvenience to them. However, since I was the one who would always pick up my son when he was sick, they would get very upset, like almost promotion punishment type situation. And it didn't make any sense because in their mind, the wife or the mom should have been doing it. And a lot of places think that way. Mom should be responsible for all childcare when that doesn't make sense. Both parents should be responsible for all childcare. Now, there's a representation issue in engineering. Like I said earlier, there's just not a lot of women in engineering, and it's hard to get more women into engineering because the numbers are so small. Look, engineering is inherently hard. Without someone encouraging you, telling you you can do it, and you should do it, you probably won't. Um, and so right now, there's about 14% of all engineers in the US are women. Surprisingly, this is a very good statistic when compared to Europe, and that's not normally the case. About 23 of the BS students at URI in engineering are women. This is good news because it beats the national average. This is trending up, but this number is a bit skewed. So when I made the slide last year, 16 to 17% of all mechanical engineers were women, which is good. It still beats the national average. When I made the slide last year, 37% of all chemical engineers were women. Again, good news, beats the national average. But these numbers fluctuate. When I graduated from URI in 2011, half of the chemical engineers were women, which is that's great. It's very hard to get to that number, let alone beat it. But there is a problem with the educational pipeline. Young girls are not as frequently encouraged to follow STEM degrees as boys. Why, I don't know. That there isn't a good reason for that. There is a lot of work being done to stop this, which is good news, but they're just not done. There is a very common negative stereotype. Girls are bad at math. Not true. Um, Math is hard, science is hard, but this stereotype is not based in reality. Um, so if you look at the statistics on the right, they're really not that far apart. Further, the variance in the noise here is large enough that if you add or subtract, so like for Algebra 2, if you added the standard deviation, it's higher than 77.7. So it looks like they belong to the same population for the most part. There's a slight variation, but again, this is so small that it really shouldn't be treated like a real thing. There's the idea that women can't handle high pressure situations, which is just not true. There are plenty of women who can. There's plenty of men who can't. The statistics don't support that statement. And then the last is, and again, this is just, I have not seen this to be true. Women aren't team players. It's not true. I have seen personally the women tend to be better communicators. I don't think I'm getting a lot of arguments on that statement. And because they're better communicators, they tend to do a better job of managing whole teams. It's just what I've observed, and that statement doesn't make sense to me. But I know that's a common feedback that people have for not wanting to work with women. So Some places the culture favors, or more accurately, is against gender diversity. This is unacceptable. If you pick up on it, either find an exit strategy or have an actual plan in place while you're there. Um, some people prefer working with more men. That happens. Some people prefer working with more women. But when it comes to hiring and promotions, it should be entirely based off of performance. When you're working, and it doesn't matter what gender you are, if somebody gets a promotion, you should be asking why they got a promotion, whether you applied to the promotion or not. Ask why they got it and you didn't. It's a very legitimate request. Your boss should want you to want to get promotions. And asking what are the criteria to get a promotion is a very reasonable thing to ask. If they start getting fussy with you when you ask about that stuff, there's probably something unethical going on. In the event it becomes clear that they promoted because they just kind of like that guy more than you, that's when you should stand your ground and say, this is unfair, this is unethical. You might have to lawyer up, but um, you do have to remember from time to time, upper management hires based off of how likely they see themselves spending time with that person and not based off of performance, which is the opposite of how they're supposed to do it. You have to make your company accountable. That means you go to them and say, hey, I've observed this. I saw you promote somebody not based off of skill. Why is that happening? How am I supposed to get promoted if I have a better skill set than that guy and he got promoted over me? Um, if that doesn't do anything, that's when you go to an agency, some kind of government agency, and vocalize what's going on. And lastly, you might need to go to an advocacy group. Um, every major engineering society has an advocacy group. Part of the reason I said everybody should be joining SWE is because of this. They have they specialize in this. They have an actual group that, if you can identify this kind of sexism going on, they will help you through it. Now, if you work for or work with ASME or ISE or IEEE or whatever it is, they also have something similar. Um, and you should feel free and empowered to go seek their help. Another issue that a lot of women run into is, and this is part work culture, this is part family culture, um, there is an expectation that they're the caregiver. So like I said earlier, when I was at Newark, it kind of turned a handful of people on their heads when I said I was the one taking care of Teddy. Like, uh, as if that was an odd thing to say. But there are also instances where if somebody gets sick, the entire family expects one of the sisters or sister-in-laws to take care of the elderly or the sick. And again, it's not the 1900s, it's not the 1950s where there were a lot of stay-at-home moms. That's just not the case anymore. Everybody works now. Whoever has the most time off and whoever's the most capable to give care should be the one doing it. Um, However, based off of how our society is structured, if the sister-in-law or sister doesn't do it, they get shunned for it, and that's not fair. Um, Now, when I say that, the way you fix that is you need to be the one that actively goes out and gives the care, and you need to vocalize and defend yourself when it happens. And when somebody else is going out of their way to help, you need to support them when they do it. So if one of the guys in your office is clearly being the caregiver and somebody comments on it, you need to defend their position. And a lot of works can be inflexible with caregiving. Um, Now, there are special instances where they have to be inflexible. Factories need to start at a very specific time and need to end at a very specific time. Um, but outside of that, in this day and age, that doesn't make sense, especially if you're an engineer. You don't, most people here, if they work at a factory, they're not going to be on the factory floor. They are going to be one of the quality control peoples or one of the design peoples. And that inflexibility doesn't make sense. Um, Now, companies periodically fire women for getting pregnant. I need to be clear, this is both unethical and illegal. And very rarely do they actually say it's because they're pregnant. To give you an example, when Sarah got pregnant with Teddy, another woman in the office got pregnant at the same time. And I don't know how my wife figured it out, but she did. And she went and talked to the lady because when you're pregnant, you like talking to other pregnant women for some reason. Um, and she was very vocal about not wanting to share, and would only talk to my wife in certain instances, basically when nobody was around. And the reason for it was she was worried she would get fired. And unfortunately, that is what ended up happening. Um, Now, what they ended up saying was she couldn't perform her duties. Um, she was a quality control person. That meant she had to go into a chem lab periodically. And when you get pregnant, just standing on your feet for extended periods of time is sometimes impossible. And that's what the chemists had to do. And so she was very slow with getting certain tasks done. She would insist on sitting in chairs in the chem lab, which isn't necessarily a problem, but it can be depending on the lab setup. Um, Now, unfortunately, this woman didn't have any recourse, or at least she didn't know if she did. Um, no one's ever going to fire you for being pregnant. They're going to find little things to have problems with. Um, and they're going to nitpick, and they're going to fire you for the little things that they nitpick. If you're pregnant and you get fired, go lawyer up. This company's already burned a bridge. Salvage that bridge, take them to court as best you can. Um, Companies will refuse to promote newlywed women, um, basically for the reason that they might get pregnant. Um, which is strange because a lot of companies will be more apt to promote newlywed men because they might have kids and will need more money. Um, if you observe something like this happening, be a good time to lawyer up. Now, there's this idea of microaggressions. At first, I was kind of like, this sounds stupid, what is this? But I've started to see it here at URI. And you would imagine that at URI, it's a liberal, progressive place. This stuff shouldn't be happening, but it does. These are everyday actions or statements that are dismissive, harmful, or insulting to someone based off of their identity, such as gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or marginalized status. They come in the form of career blocking, hearing privilege, and mansplaining. All right, what's career blocking? A form of discrimination that negatively impacts on the individual's professional growth and development. This type of behavior may be unintentional. The person being blocked tends to resent other employees and the company. So, an example of career blocking would be only giving certain tasks to men and only giving certain tasks to women. Um, this class, this semester, pretty low on the number of women in it, but what I have observed happens a lot on group projects is the writing task, the note-taking task, always gets delegated to the woman on the team. This is a form of career blocking, especially in the workforce. Um, and all of the technical tasks get delegated to the men. This is an ethics class, so I'm not giving you a lot of technical work. Um, but I've seen this also happen in senior projects where the guys will intentionally refuse to let one of the girls, or the girl on the team, more likely, do anything outside of take notes. This is career blocking. Um, Everybody on the team more or less is the same skill set. There's no reason that everybody can't help on the technical side. And you've all graduated high school, you can all take notes. And there's hearing privilege. This is extremely aggravating. whether you're a woman or not. I have to deal with this from time to time, and it's infuriating. This phenomenon occurs when someone refuses to understand one group of people, but when presented with identical information from another completely understands a message. So an example of this is if Ashley explains a concept to her boss, Tim, and Tim doesn't understand it. Ashley's coworker, Bob, repeats verbatim what Ashley says and Tim understands it. This is another form of career blocking if it happens a lot. It limits opportunities for everyone who has to deal with it. I wouldn't say this is an exclusively man-to-woman issue, but I would say it happens a lot more. Um, Further, I'm sure people have just dealt with this when working with certain people. Some people just don't get along, but I've had a handful of managers that did this, where there was nothing I could say or do that would cause them to understand anything I was doing. This is infuriating. Um, you need to make sure you're not doing this. And if you see somebody doing it, you need to say something. People don't correct themselves unless groups of people are telling them that they're doing stuff like this. If you see one of your bosses having hearing privilege with one of your coworkers, you need to say something as it's happening. All right. Now, there are some issues with hearing privilege. Um, so ultimately, hearing privilege is a form of discrimination. If you can prove that it's systematic or causing career mobility issues, lawyer up and move to another company. Um, but when you're dealing with hearing privilege, you need to have realistic expectations. Um, they might have a very good reason for not listening. Um, Try to comply with their agenda. Um, if they're just trying to if their mind's on other things, that might be driving why they're not listening. Make it clear that you're trying to work with them. Um, this is when email is extremely important. Document everything. Email is a natural form of documentation. Once you sent that message exists forever. Um, Go to your coworkers and point out that it's happening. So I've had some bosses who didn't listen to anybody, let alone me, and so it wasn't a me specific problem. But I have had supervisors where it was a me specific problem. When you're working with your coworkers, have them amplify what you're saying. That is to say, when you say something, they need to repeat you verbatim and see if he suddenly understands it. Once this happens, you do need to appeal to the boss and explain to them what's going on. Why, when I say it, you don't understand, but when he says it, you do. And you need to document everything. So for me, what I had to do is I would send my boss an email with all of the information that he asked for. And I would make sure that the thing he was actually asking for was like one or two sentences up front. And then I'd give all the rest of the information the rest of the email. And then I'd go talk to him and I'd say it again. And the thing is, I knew half the time he wasn't listening. But it got to the point where the other bosses saw what was going on. And they actually had to say to Stan, why are you doing that? It was infuriating that I had to deal with it, but I did it. And you're probably at some point in time going to have to deal with something like this. Sometimes it's the customer, sometimes it's the supplier, but you're going to have to deal with something like this at some point in time. All right, the next is mansplaining. This is when a man explains something condescendingly under the assumption that a woman cannot understand it. Um, Pretty straightforward. Now, it's mansplaining when it's a man to a woman, but um, just doing this in general is kind of a dick move, and you shouldn't be doing it at all, whether you're talking to a woman or not. So there are ways to combat mansplaining. The first is you need to be assertive. You need to firmly state you're familiar with the issue and don't need extra help. Um, you need to redirect. You need to change the subject to a personal experience. If the phrase, I saw with my own eyes this happen, and somebody then tries to tell you you saw something else, they might be hearing privilege. Get help. Have other people vouch for your experience. Make them accountable. This behavior does happen from time to time accidentally, and it's not personal. However, if it is systemic, it's toxic. And you need to document everything. So when people are mansplaining, make sure you put everything in email. Sometimes that requires you to say, hey, per our discussion just now, you said this, I said this. And maybe that's when you have to be assertive and redirective, but you need to document it. Because without a paper trail, without proof, sometimes some of this stuff you can't change. Um, it's the unfortunate reality of the situation. Um, so when I worked for Newick, I was a chemical engineer, or still am a chemical engineer, but I was their materials person. And I worked with this woman who was, when I was busy, they'd give her material stuff too. And she got this email about this product called Sodazorb. Sodazorb uh, was used to clean air. There's these things called air scrubbers. If you are scuba diving or if you have to be in certain types of surgeries, they will put this in your face mask. So that way the air stays clean. Um, and the Navy needed to buy some. Well, the original manufacturing line changed its name. It didn't exist anymore. Um, Now, I was too busy, so I just pawned this off to her and said, hey, can you handle this? I didn't really think anything of it. Um, but she went through and she did the assessment and she realized the manufacturing line never shut off. It just got bought by another company. Originally, the company was called W.R. Grace, and then it got bought by Thermo Scientific. Thermo Scientific renamed the assembly line, or more accurately, renamed the product W.R. Grace's Sodazorb. And so we had what was called a spec document or supplier document, where we would explicitly state you are only allowed to buy Sodazorb from W.R. Grace, and it would say the product information. And so the one I was working with recommended we change the spec document to say must buy Sodazorb, and then listed the chemical properties of Sodazorb such that when you buy it, it meets these chemical properties, and then have a note, as of today, you can purchase this from Thermo Fisher's product line, W.R. Grace Thermo Sodazorb. And she wrote this up, and then she sent it out to the people who asked us to get it done. And they didn't know her very well. And they said, well, there's no way she could understand this material. And they didn't like her answer, and there was other shenanigans going on there, but they would pass it around amongst themselves, and eventually one of the people would email her directly, because they knew she was a materials person, and say, hey, I got this report, they want us, they said we could buy Sodazorb from this other company, could you take a look at their assessment and tell me if this makes sense? So she reviewed it, and she realized that she had made a couple typos. So she fixed the typos, and she said, now, for the most part, I agree with this assessment, but there are a couple typos, so I modified the document. Here you go. Then about 2 weeks later, another person would send her the edited document with the typos and say, hey, could you review this for me? I don't fully understand the chemistry side of this. And keep in mind, this document had a title page with her name on it. And finally, she had to have this really big meeting with everybody where she explained to them that she wrote the document. She already knew it was in the document. She was the one giving the recommendation. But all of the men in the room couldn't process that she might understand what she was talking about. Now, this is another issue women frequently run into in the workforce. Um, the big one is sexual harassment. These are unwanted advances, jokes, comments, or gestures. There's gender discrimination. There is unequal pay and unequal treatment. There's retaliation. And then there's isolation and exclusion. Um, so, engineering isn't the only male dominated industry. Military and paramilitary are both examples of male dominated industries. My mother was a 911 operator for South Kingstown. Um, when she first got hired, one of the women that worked there took my mother aside and said, "Just so you know, one of the cops is named Stedman. He's kind of a creep. He's going to ask if you want to have sex." And my mom was like, "That's gross, but whatever." And she didn't believe it. And sure enough, one day when it was just her and Stedman in the police station, he asked. And my mother had a bit of, she was assertive and angry about the request and shooed him away. But there was no repercussion to him for doing that. And that's unacceptable. Um, that was a product of the time. But if you run into a situation like that at work, if you see something like that at work, you need to speak up. Um, that's disgusting. That makes everybody involved uncomfortable, um, and it needs to be stopped. The next instance my mother had to deal with was with Joycey. Love Joycey, wonderful woman. She was a paratrooper for the Army. After 9/11, she was one of the people that ran Guantanamo Bay. Um, Joycey sat my mother down and said, "If you want to survive in the military or paramilitary, police station, you have three options in front of you. You either need to be a bitch, a slut, or a lesbian. The bitch is going to be assertive and mean whenever somebody is rude to them, establishes their position in life. Slut, well, she gets along with the boys and laughs at all their stupid jokes and doesn't get offended by anything. And then the lesbian, well, she is one of the boys." Um, Obviously, my mother decided to be the bitch in this story. However, the fact that she had to do any of those to survive is completely unacceptable. If you find you're in a workforce that does this, it's shameful, and you need to work to fix it. Now, I have up there retaliation. This happens, and it happens for a handful of reasons, and it doesn't really matter why it happens. It's unacceptable. You don't need to be the one who's being retaliated against for you to say something. Um, when you go to certain places, you will see magazine posters on the wall, um, sexualizing people or marginalizing people. Uh, you need to make a you need to correct it. You need to remove those things. You need to say that's unprofessional and take them down. Um, it's very common for some places to encourage this stuff, and you shouldn't be in those situations. But retaliation is an example of that would be if you pointed out that somebody got a promotion and you should have gotten the promotion, but instead of them giving you another opportunity down the line, they started to isolate you, stop giving you projects. They would sometimes it's referred to as being iced, and make you want to quit. Sometimes, if somebody is exhibiting sexual harassment behavior and you say something about it, instead of having them stop, which is the number one thing management should do, you should feel safe in the workplace. Um, they tell the guy, "Hey, so and so complained about you," and then they take it out on you. Sometimes that taking it out on is like more extreme sexual harassment. Sometimes it's just making the workplace hostile. Um, and sometimes it actually affects your promotions. This is all super unethical, super illegal. But if you don't say anything, if you don't do anything, if you are observing it and it's happening to somebody else, you need to say something. Um, so when I worked for the Navy, you got to remember in the armed forces, the DoD, the Army, Navy, Air Force, more than half of the workforce is under 25. And so there's a handful of statements they need to make, not because they think the entire workforce needs to hear it, but because they know the 25-year-olds need to hear it, and they represent more than half of the workforce. Um, so sexual harassment is any unwanted or unwelcome sexual advances, requests, verbal or physical contact or conduct, and it's especially an issue if it's intimidating, hostile, or offensive. This might include talking about sex, making sexual gestures, touching, spreading rumors. When I worked for the Navy, we had to have a training where they had to say probably 15 times, you're not allowed to touch women. You have to ask before you touch a woman. It wasn't you have to ask before you touch somebody. It was very explicit not to touch women unless you get permission. Um, and the reason for this is because there was an actual problem. Um, the thing is about harassment is it very rarely is just somebody making jokes. What's usually actually happening is somebody is testing the waters. They're seeing how far they can get before they get in trouble. And they use it as a form of uh, behavior control. So if you see this harassment going on, even though it's not directed at you, it doesn't mean this person's not going to start um, pursuing others. Um, and so if management doesn't effectively address it immediately, um, the person's probably going to escalate it. They're either going to spread it to other people or they're going to turn harassment into assault. Retaliation. So this tends to be some kind of punishment for being assertive, and that assertiveness is either related to discrimination, harassment, or stereotyping. Um, and sometimes that retaliation is just icing you. So they find some punishment for you. They give you a task you don't like to do. They discredit you. They create fear. They're just trying to maintain control. This is all unethical and illegal. They might think this is normal, but it's not. All right. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about gender diversity. Um, Now I'm going to talk about racial diversity. So this is the NSBE. If we're in class, I would ask if anybody in the class was part of NSBE. Um, it's a similar organization to SWE. Then there's SHIP, Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, similar mission. Um, all of the issues I've just mentioned, so mansplaining, hearing privilege, retaliation, yes, while I was talking about those were specific to men to women or just towards women in general. But all of that still applies, regardless of whether you're a woman or not. If you are also black or Hispanic, people will do some of those behaviors because of that. And the ways to combat it are more or less the same. Instead of going to SWE, you might have to go to NSBE or SHIP, but they still exist. Um, Now, for racial diversity, the utilitarian argument's more or less the same, but one thing that I want to point out um, is when you make a product, you want to make it for the end user. And I can't tell you how many times, and this is like a pet peeve of mine, um, the designer has no connection to the user. When I had my house rebuilt, I had it remodeled. The guy who managed the project was Caucasian, but the rest of his team was either black or Hispanic. And they were the ones that were using the nail guns. They were the ones that were tearing up my roof. They were the ones building everything. If I were asked to design a better nail gun, I wouldn't know what to do. I wouldn't know what the user actually needs. I would go to those guys and say, well, how can I make this better? But the thing is, it's a lot better if they designed it because they're the ones who use it. So you want a diverse background of designers. You don't want just the guy who went to that particular college and has that special degree. No, you want the people who actually use the product to design the product because they're the ones who actually know what the inconveniences are. They know how to improve it. There's also a Kantian reason to want to have racial diversity. And this is more or less the same as with women. Um, it's disrespectful to not want it. You really can't universalize it. It's a categorical imperative. Now, these are the representation statistics. So on the left is just the general US population. About 58% are European or Caucasian. 19% are Latino. About 12% are African. 6% are Asian. But when you look at engineers, the statistics change a lot. Um, it becomes a lot more Caucasian, becomes a lot more Asian as well, but it drops with the African Latin populations. It goes down. So, like I said earlier, engineering is inherently hard. Without somebody encouraging you to stick around and become an engineer, it's really hard to do it. Um, and so we need to give help where we can. These are very common stereotypes that people who are, not white have to deal with quite frequently. Um, they're technically unable, culturally incompetent, unwilling to work hard, affirmative action hires. Um, so again, the solution to the culture problem is demand transparency. It's the same exact as before with women. Um, communicate you have problems. These are the common microaggressions: stereotyping, tokenism, insensitivity, bias in evaluation, and exclusion. Now, if you experience any of these, stay calm, assert the truth, provide perspective, but you also need to document the incident um, and demonstrate that they're wrong. So for here, I have saying the Irish are drunks that only drink whiskey. Yeah, I could get upset by that. I'm Irish. Um, if I got angry about it, people would be less apt to listen to me. Point out the root of the stereotype and how it applies to you. Shift the conversation and compare it to other stereotypes and show that the stereotype isn't true.